Nomadic The Unwanted. Written by Brian Shinomiya. Narrated by Arnea Ahmetspahic. It was a chilly winter's day as Anatu stood in the ruins of what was no doubt once a memorable city. It has been hundreds of years since the fall of humans. She liked to think she was an intricate human and not just a greenish-yellow skin humanoid. Anatu was the first of her kind, at least that she was aware of. She stood tall on two legs like a human, had two arms like a human, and could speak like a human. But her skin was colorful and vibrant, with self-done red diamond tattoos running down her left cheek, a permanent stream of blood-red tears. She had the ability to learn at a rapid pace, and her agile, cat-like nature frightened the few humans left on Earth. Hundreds of years ago, humans began to mutate with no explanation. Most of the new species were violent, cannibalistic creatures prepared to kill upon birth. Others, assuming, were more like herself. Most of the time, she was in the dark about her own history. She didn't know about those like her or where she came from, other than the stories from 20 years ago. She stood in the rubble of downtown, wearing her hakama, a long and purple-plated skirt-like garment held up by a thick rope. The crisp air kissed the top of her latex jumpsuit, and the armor on her right arm weighed heavy due to her exhaustion. The oversized casa, a wide mushroom-sapped hat that came to a point at its apex, was tightly secured around her chin by a thin ribbon. It shaded her sensitive scarlet eyes from the winter's sun. Anatu was chased from her place of birth on the North American continent through the island of Japan, ending up on the European and Asian continents. Glass crunched and pebbles scrapped under her thick boots as she turned to survey her surroundings. Hundreds of rusted cars were left to decay, while crumbled-like buildings still stood with brown vines tangled around them. It seemed to be the only support these weak structures were held by, all traces of green thick ropes along the edges and windows. It's been long since Father Winter, as she called the season, zapped the life from the vines. Father Winter and Mother Summer are the only parents she's ever known. The depths of both seasons gave her an icy cold heart and a white-hot fury that was at many times unleashed upon the mutants. She did not dare blame the humans for instigating her features due to their fear of her. She represented her own self, while nature guided her dangerous and in-depth journey. The night was setting in, and Anatu needed to find shelter. She clutched the sword at her side as she walked towards an imposing structure. It still stood tall, refusing to collapse. All around her were remnants of civilization, shops, businesses, and signs in Cyrillic. She knew the language, but not the country where it came from. Anatu stopped at the large gate enclosing her home for the night. She carefully surveyed the building, noticing shattered windows and gaping holes in the walls. Anatu learned the hard way of always using the front door. The mutants were smart to watch for the large holes in the buildings, but ironically, they never kept an eye on normal entrances. Her sharp sword was out as soon as she entered the building. She strained her ears, listening for any sounds of the mutated creatures, soldiers of the army in the night. It was tough, as they barely made a sound when they moved. It was soon clear to her that she was in a prison. Even with nerves of raw iron, Anatu was on edge, slowly creeping into the mysterious building. It wasn't the mutated cannibals that scared her, but ghosts. There was an immense metallic bang that caused Anatu to whirl around with her sword raised when she spotted a fat, scaly, rat-like creature scampering out of the doorway. She sighed. It was time for her to find a place to rest, and luckily, her species only needed an hour and a half worth of sleep, at the very least, to function properly. Anatu's eyes were best suited for little to no light, but the human side of her feared the dark. She rounded a corner leading to what was labeled Cell Block Z. Cautiously and slowly, she pushed the door open, which caused an immense shriek from the heavy-weighted door hinges. She was answered by an equally high-pitched scream from the darkness ahead. She could hear the hunger in the creature's voice and assumed it was ready to feast at any minute. Anatu, prepared and confident, paused at the sound and refrained from approaching the darkness. It was not odd that she was lost in a haunted building alien to her. This was her life, dangerous and unknown. She rushed into the cell block and was met by an intersection with block Z2 directly ahead, and quickly took the hall to her left to block Z1. Each step she took was feather-like, barely brushing against the cement. Anatu spotted a bucket and held it back, aiming for the hall leading to cell block Z3. When it landed, echoes of metallic chaos sounded throughout the room. Anatu hastily entered cell block Z1, ready to strike, as she scanned the surroundings demolished by time and the historic elements gathered from destruction. She climbed over the roof of the building, which was now on the floor. Tattered clothes and bones with teeth marks littered the room. Anatu knew that she was in a nest, possibly the best place to be at night, as its inhabitants would be out hunting. She turned and watched the doorway, backed up to the stairs. "Ghost!" she gasped and stifled as something brushed against her shoulder. She hastily spun and swung her sword, slicing through wires that were hanging from above. Anatu, embarrassed and panting, thought she was being attacked by a ghost. It was only wires. She was relieved no one witnessed that. She took her place at the top of the stairs to guard her domain for the night, the entire wasteland that was once full of life and love, laughing families. A world once full of hate as well. It was all her domain now, a dead, decaying kingdom gifted by the humans to whoever could survive in it, and Anatu was determined to be its queen. The sounds of the cannibals searching through cell block Z2 carried on like wind to her ears. It was only a matter of time before they found her. Standing atop the stairs with her sword tip on the ground beside her left foot, she resembled a statue of the goddess of death, ready to pounce. Come to me so I can release my fury," she whispered to herself, her battle cry. As night took hold of the land, Anatu settled into a cell, sitting on a toilet. She managed to catch half an hour of sleep, awoken only by the sounds of the creatures clumsily clambering over the rubble and struggling to find her. Anatu yanked a throwing spear out of its sheath on her right bicep and held it to her side. The satire case creaked and buckled under a hungry creature's heavy footsteps. They were getting close. The creaking turned to scuffs as the cannibal reached the second floor and trailed to the opposite side of her. With lightning speed, Anatu leaned out of her cell and threw the spike. Silently, it traveled through the air, piercing the creature's spine just below its skull, killing it instantly and allowing it no time to cry out. A dull thud sounded as its body hit the floor, and all other noise from the floor below stopped. The other creatures sniffed the air. Frantically, they climbed and rushed up the staircase. They ran over to the body of their fallen friend, who was now dinner. Sounds of flesh being torn and chewed filled the room as the creatures fought and feasted. Anatu watched the doorway, the horrific sight in her view, while a bright red light streamed in through the doorway of the room, almost taking on a whitish-red hue. The room around her bathed in a palette of red brick and maroon, the latter being cast as deep shadows. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. A giant, muscular creature stood hunched, its leathery and scaly skin stretched tight over its muscles and tumors. One tumor in particular on its shoulder was so large it forced the creature's head to one side. Anatu drew and hurled a spike at the cannibal. It howled in pain as it staggered back, and within seconds, 3 others were in the doorway, fighting over the new meal it had become. Anatu picked up her sword and propped it against the wall when a cannibal noticed her. It rushed into the cell. She slashed her sword across its chest, exposing the creature's heavy ribs. The smell of its fresh orange blood drew the attention of the other 2 cannibals, and the sound of feasting had stopped, grabbing the attention of others throughout the cell block. As the mutants rushed the doorway, Anatu twirled around in the confinement of the prison cell. She quickly built up momentum for her blade, bringing it up and over her head, only to bring it down on a cannibal's head, driving it down to the creature's guts and killing it. Her attention was now on the last one crowding the cell. She lunged forward, stabbed, and forced him against the wall, creating space in between them. It slashed a clawed hand at Anatu, but she dodged it and cut it off. It shirked in pain. Anatu hurriedly left the cell, only to be met by the sight of 10 to 15 more hungry creatures fighting each other to be the first to get to the meals left on the floor. Anatu rushed backwards to make room for them to parade into the cell. The 10 mutants that were rushing towards her all ran into the cell. She kicked the door closed. The door clanged closed, and the sound drew the attention of the 5 remaining mutants. They roared and scratched as they rushed at Anatu. She twirled and bolted towards the mod, slicing one of her attackers in half at the waist. She stabbed the second through its face, before sending a throwing spike through the heart of the third. The 2 final attackers crowded the second-floor landing. Anatu ran and jumped onto the railing. Luckily, with her perfect balance, she gracefully ran down the railing and cut off the heads of both creatures at once. She hopped off the railing and returned to her cell. Anatu quickly peered into it through a small hatch halfway up the door. She almost wished she hadn't done that. The sight that greeted her eyes was a gruesome show of creatures lining up to tear each other apart in the tight confines of a room just the size of a car. Anatu struggled to throw the bodies off the second floor before finding a new cell to hide in. Suddenly, she was awoken again by the sounds of something eating on the first floor. By how energetic she felt, she must have slept for maybe 2 hours. She clutched her sword and walked out onto the second-floor landing. Below her, on the first floor, a large beast was feasting on the bodies. As quietly as she could, she jumped down with her sword tip angled down to pierce the hungry creature. It let out a dull grunt as it collapsed dead under her feet. It was time for her to move. She crept out of the cell block back to the main hall where the building had fallen silent and most of the mutants were still out hunting. She rounded the corner and found herself behind a female mutant. Anatu took the opportunity by swiftly slicing her neck, letting its head drop to the floor. She rushed down to cell block Z2. This section of the prison was in better shape, or at least the roof hadn't fallen in yet. "Where are you?" she whispered, not seeing any creatures milling about. She was ready to slaughter every creature lurking in the depths of that prison. Anatu took a moment to inspect her sword blade. She had it sharpened 2 days ago, and the edge was already worn out. It would need to be sharpened in the morning. She only had 1 throwing spike on her right bicep, but she could make more. She still had 5 throwing knives secured to her left thigh. The sounds of multiple footsteps rushing down to cell block Z1 caught Anatu's attention as she cleaned the slimy orange blood off her sword. There were too many creatures for her to fight, but luckily, they would kill each other over the feast she left them. That's when an idea crept into her mind. Quietly, Anatu peered down the hall, scanning for any signs of danger as she inched her way back to cell block C1. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she reached the door, and with a shaky hand, she reached for the doorknob. With all her might, she forced it to shut. The hefty door squeaked and buckled, stopping halfway. Anatu swore as the cannibals snarled and howled. They all gathered and ran to the door. Anatu ran forward and slammed into a large steel door, forcing it shut. With a loud metallic clunk, the lock sealed the door shut. Anatu, with all her might, ran down the hall in fear that more hungry creatures were coming for her. She came to the intersection and spotted a small door, kicked it open, and was greeted by a ladder. She climbed it, hoping that it would lead her to the roof, but it only got her to the second floor. Anatu quickly realized that she was in the remnants of a cafeteria. She had to find her way out of the prison. After wandering around for what felt like hours, Anatu was graced by the sight of an exit. Although her luck was short-lived as she left the prison and entered a fenced-in yard where the fence was lined with concertina wire. Concertina wire was brutal. She hated it with a passion. She knew how to handle barbed wire, but concertina wire was a different kind of pain. All it took was imagining getting tangled in the loose coils of the razor-topped wire one time, and she was instantly glad the man who invented it was dead. The yard was littered with rubble from the crumbling building, as well as skeletons. Anatu wandered the yard, looking for a hole in the fence. Her search went on and on along the metal fence, searching for any kind of opening. Swear after swear left Anatu's mouth. She had to be out of the building before sunrise. As the first ray of fiery orange sunlight illuminated the horizon, she spotted a small gap in the chain-link fence. She carefully squeezed through the gap and took off running across the field towards the city. Half a mile from her, she spotted figures rushing to the prison. She took long, leaping strides, trying to cover as much ground as possible. Suddenly, there was one in her path. Effortlessly, she cut him down as her vision blurred from the sunlight. She tripped over a stone and rolled across the ground. Anatu managed to land on her feet and started running again, only to hit a rusted car. Anatu found herself in the arms of another mutant creature. She managed to hold his head back as she frantically searched the car hood for a weapon. He growled in her face, saliva dripped on her chest. She felt the strength of his grip dig into her hips. She was drastically losing the fight. The monster was overpowering her when she found something sharp and plunged it into the creature's chest. The object she grasped turned out to be a piece of the windshield. Anatu was able to free herself from the monster. She grasped her sword and rushed through the city again, struggling to find her way as her vision grew worse and worse. Anatu tore a strip of fabric from her hakama and tied it around her eyes. The fabric was just thick enough to block out the sun so she could see. The sun had fully risen. At that moment, she was relatively safe. She entered what was once an office building and took out her whetstone. She set out on the arduous task of sharpening her sword. It was a chore. She had mastered it but loathed the task because of how frequently she had to do it. Once she finished, Anatu slumped into her chair and focused on her right knee where an old injury was. She rested her palms on her knee and pressed on it. A long, satisfying grunt left her lips as the pain and tightness left the joint. She had injured it years ago from falling down a flight of stairs. She observed her sword, a slender green blade with a slight curve and a grey handle with a gold pommel. Flashbacks flipped through her mind. remembering the time she took it from a skeleton. It has served her well for a year now. Her attention drifted to the window, noticing a figure outside as it stumbled through the street. It wasn't an actual human, but another mutation, a zombie, the humans called it. "Just walk away," she mumbled. Unfortunately, this did not happen. It stood in the street and looked all around, trying to find something. She could only imagine what it was searching for as she took her sword from the desk. Anatu retreated further into the building, looking for another exit. Her luck turned for the better as she found a tunnel and quickly entered it. She removed her blindfold as the light dimmed and made her way further inside the tunnel, crawling inch by inch until a bright light came into view. She was surprised to find an old fountain in the center of a cluster of buildings. She scanned the area, no signs of movement, only the same scenery she was used to. "You there!" A man called out suddenly and rather loudly. She stood up, still gripping her sword. "Are you deaf? What race are you?" he asked, sounding as if he was drawing closer. She glanced at him through her blindfold. "Oh, you're blind too," he said. "I can see and hear you," Anatu replied. "What race are you?" the man repeated himself. "I don't know," Anatu replied. "What have you got to trade? I have daggers, sunglasses, food," he said, shaking his head. Anatu turned to get a good look at the man. He was a rather old-looking human, with tanned skin and grey hairs sticking out from under a knitted cap. His appearance looked as if he hadn't cared for it in a long time, dressed in dirty, tattered clothes bundled up for the winter. "You're not cold?" he asked. "No, I do not feel cold yet," she replied, as she fished out colored shards of glass from a pouch on her belt, which rested under a thick rope. She knew the colored glass was what humans used as money now. Brown and yellow glass were the least expensive, but blue was little more worth than red, and ironically in her mind, green was worth the most. Anatu held out a palm full of thick green shards with rounded edges, making them all the more valuable. "Well, what can I interest you in?" he asked. Anatu thought about it for a moment. "The dagger, food, and those metal bars," she said, pointing to his breast pocket. She knew that they were perfect for her throwing spikes. "Deal," he said as he handed her the metal, dagger, and a large fried rat. He nodded and quickly left. Anatu watched him leave. She had seen his kind around scavengers, but she never had such an interaction with one. She was quick to leave in case he came back to rob her. Her stomach grumbled, chewing on her food as she walked around. Anatu looked behind her, making sure she wasn't being followed by anyone. The fried rat was more than enough to fill her neglected stomach. She tossed the remnants of her meal aside as she knelt near a rough builder and set to work, grinding down the ends of the metal stick into points to replace her throwing spikes. Finally, after an hour, she finished one spike and stuffed it into its holder on the right bicep and left. It was not a good idea to stay in one place for long during the day, and judging from the sun's position in the sky, it was still morning. As Anatu left an alley, she suddenly ran into two zombies. They chased and grabbed at her with bone-like hands. She quickly reacted and dodged their grips. Anatu lashed out with the new weapon she had in hand, the dagger. She stabbed the closest zombie in the chest. She felt a tug in her palm as she pulled away. The handle from the dagger broke off, and the blade stayed in the zombie's chest. "Damn you!" she roared, throwing the dagger handle in the zombie's face. She quickly drew her sword. It was a hard lesson to learn. She knew she should have tested the weapon before buying it. Anatu ducked to dodge a clawed hand. She took an opening to slash at the attacker's leg, cutting it off. Her attention turned to the other zombie, with the dagger blade still in its chest. A forceful swing of her blade, and its head was rolling down the street as she took off. Anatu's rage was boiling with how the dagger had failed at such a crucial time, but the scavenger was long gone and selling trash to others. At least she had her sword and throwing weapons, and the fried rat was fried just right. As Anatu walked, she came to a familiar sight of a border crossing where she was about to enter a new country. She hoped to find a human settlement that would take her in. She longed for any normal interaction. Although human settlements only accepted those who had value, Anatu felt confident. She was a warrior with skills to offer, but she just wasn't a human. She clenched her jaw as she stepped over the dividing line, and just like that, Anatu was in a new country with new adventures. She liked to think only opportunities lay ahead, but most of the time, she was alone. Most of the time, it was the same shit under a different flag, and whatever tattered remnants remained that she could gather to survive. The scene she passed was the same thing she saw at the Chinese and Mongolian borders: rusted military vehicles and other cars set to block the border, all of which had been stripped of anything useful. The city beyond the border was in disarray under a sunny sky. An eerie silence had settled in decades ago. She never got used to the bone-chilling silence, the reminder that she was completely alone. A reminder that still hurt her already scarred heart. But she choked back her tears and kept moving forward. Unfortunately, the world she was born into was not a safe one to cry in. Just as she was about to cry out a string of swears, she spotted someone ahead. They both locked eyes at the same time. Anatu took her normal defensive stance, a hand on her sword and a hand at her side. "Hey, hi!" he yelled in her direction. It took her a moment to respond and to make sense of his language. "What are you?" he asked, drawing closer. She stayed silent and still. "Can you answer?" he asked. "No, wait, I don't think she's like the other things." His voice was loud, enough for the others to hear. She looked to her left and then to her right. She was slowly being surrounded by 4 other humans. They closed in on her. She didn't like the feeling about this. Her heart rate started to increase. She clenched her sword, but her hands stayed at her sides. "Where the hell did you come from?" a man asked from behind her. "I've been traveling for years," Anatu said. "Well, she can certainly talk. The other mutants can't," the man that initiated this interaction said. "I am a human," Anatu stated. "That's impossible. You're green," another voice said. "I can walk and talk and fight like a human," Anatu stated. "We don't walk around blindfolded," another voice sounded from behind her. "My eyesight is best suited at night," Anatu said, removing her blindfold. "That could be useful," the man in front of her said in excitement. "She said she could fight." They all murmured around her. Anatu glanced around at the 4 men circling her. They all looked like scavengers, unarmed with large overflowing duffel bags. "Fine, she can come with us while we look for suppliers. We'll pay her," the one behind Anatu said. "I'm looking for a settlement," Anatu said. "Oh yeah? Which one?" he asked. "One that will accept me." "Good luck," he replied under his breath. "Then you can protect yourselves," she replied as she walked away. "Wait!" the first man yelled as he ran after her, but stopped as her sword met his neck. He hadn't even seen her hand move. "We can talk to the others, but we need to see if you're not lying to us," he said. She stared at him behind her blindfold and removed her sword. "My God, you are fast," he added. "Fine," she huffed. "Feed me, supply me, and I'll babysit you." Anatu knew that she was being used for protection. but it was her first lead in a long time. "I know your settlement will not accept me," she said. One of the men handed her a can of peas. She quickly opened it and ate it. Her fear of being poisoned had long gone past. She was now on a mission with strangers, and it was kill or be killed. Anatu watched from under her blindfold as the men set out, searching for treasure in piles of trash. She was handed a canteen by the same man who had fed her. She started to reach for the canteen, but retracted her hand to throw a knife. The man gasped. They all looked around. Their eyes fell on a zombie twitching on the ground, with Anatu's knife poking out of its mouth. "Glad we have you," one man yelled. The group of men decided to search elsewhere. The scavenging party stopped dead in their tracks as 3 more zombies came into the view. Her sword was out as they fell behind her. A zombie charged at her. The men yelled in panic as she stayed motionless. She slashed at the monster and charged the second one as the first hit the ground. She whirled and slashed the second across its back, severing its spine, and impaled the third through its heart while keeping her eyes on the group of men. They hit the ground as she threw 2 knives at the zombies, rushing them from behind. Anatu crushed the last living zombie's skull under her boot as she went to retrieve her knives. "Let's get back to the settlement," one of the men yelled behind her. When she turned around, the men had left their bags and ran. Anatu sighed as she searched the bags for food or anything useful. They at least owed her that much. She was not disappointed as she found 3 more cans of food and 2 sharp daggers. Darkness was preparing to set in. Her routine was to find shelter since a human settlement was now out of the question. Archers and booby traps would surely be waiting to greet her. She walked 2 blocks until she saw a quiet 1-story house. She followed her rule of using the front door. It wasn't a surprise that the men had abandoned her. Human warriors never left the settlements, and scavengers were the bottom rungs of the ladder. She sat on the floor in the house. Her thoughts drifted off to what life must have been like when people lived in places like this. As the night got darker and darker, the monsters came out to claim the land, making their bone-chilling cries and howls, all searching for food. Anatu hoped there was enough distance between her and the dead zombies. She was certain something was bound to find her. Slowly, her mind drifted off, and she fell asleep, as the horrifying sounds had become something like a lullaby to her. Something shuffling around the room awoke her. She looked and spotted a large spider crawling from the corner. She swiped at it with her sword, hoping to only scare it away. Anatu could tell she had gotten an unusual amount of sleep, but it was still dark outside. A chill ran over Anatu's body. She took a moldy, tattered blanket from the couch and threw it around herself. She opened another can of food. The sounds of the creatures had stopped. After eating, she wandered around the house. It was clear that the house had been picked clean, everything except the bones in the bathtub. She checked everywhere, pulled drawers and looked in closets, but there was nothing she could use. Anatu peered out the window. A thick cloud of fog was setting in. A feeling of loneliness weighed on her shoulders. The vacant hours slowly ticked by, and gradually it began to grow lighter and lighter outside until a grey, foggy morning had set in. Anatu packed her belongings and left the house. She walked into a foggy, cold world, ready for another day of wandering and killing.